Okay, we are now streaming on Facebook. Um, at this time, I don't have any guests to admit, but hopefully some will join us. We'll go ahead and read the disclaimer. This free virtual series features an educational program on a topic of mental health. This event is for generalized information and is in no way a form of diagnosis. Please consult with your doctor or therapist for specific medical or psychological advice. We are merely starting the discussion to help destigmatize mental health. Mental illnesses, symptoms, diagnoses, and treatment methods are all a highly individualized process. With that, I would like to welcome you to Psychology Social Hour hosted by the St. Joseph Museums. Tonight, our guest is Mr. Robert Whitaker. He is a well-renowned author who has authored 5 books, I believe, most of which deal with mental illness and drug addiction in America. So with that, I will let Mr. Robert take over.
Well, thanks for the introduction. Nice to be here. I thought maybe first what I'll do is just a talk about how I got involved in this whole subject of psychiatry and the history of psychiatry. And my background was I worked as a newspaper reporter covering medical and science for a long time. And then in 1998, I co-wrote a series for the Boston Globe on abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings. And we were looking at different types of experiments, both commercially funded or research, and also funded by the NIMH, which obviously involved violations of informed consent and exposed the patients to real harm. And that would have been done with that series, except while I was doing the research for that 4-part series, I came upon a couple studies that belied what I knew to be true about the history of psychiatry. Now, the conventional history of psychiatry is that we get the first antipsychotic medications in 1955. The first one is in the United States is Thorazine. And this marks a great advance in the care of the mentally ill. It enables patients diagnosed with schizophrenia and other major disorders to live in the community. It led to the emptying of the asylums. And if you look in conventional histories, it talks about this great leap forward in sort of treatment of severe mental disorders. However, when I was doing this research, I came upon a study by the researchers at Harvard Medical School, which traced, in this paper, they traced the recovery rate for schizophrenia patients over the past 100 years. And they found that recovery rates for schizophrenia patients today were no better than they had been in the first third of the 20th century. And in fact, since 1975, had been declining. So this study belied what I understood to be true, which was that we were making great advances in understanding the nature of these disorders and the treatments for them, the drug treatments for them. And the second group of studies that really sort of stunned me and made me want to investigate this subject more were 2 studies done by the World Health Organization. And in these 2 studies, the World Health Organization compared outcomes for schizophrenia patients diagnosed by Western doctors in 3, quote, developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria, with outcomes in the US and other, quote, developed countries. And in the first study, which was 5 years in length, they found that outcomes were much, much better in the developing countries. So much so, they concluded that living in a developed country is a strong predictor that you won't have a good outcome if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, this was stunning because, of course, we are very proud of our Western medicine. And so after the first such study, they hypothesized, the World Health Organization researchers hypothesized that maybe the reason for the superior outcomes in the poor or developing countries of the world was that there the patients were medication compliant. They didn't resist taking their antipsychotic medication. So in that second study, they looked at medication usage. And they were expecting to find that in the poor countries, patients were much more compliant with taking the medication. But what they found instead was that in the poor countries and in the developing countries, they used the drugs acutely for during the initial time of psychosis, but not chronically. They didn't keep people on the medications long term. So it was a different paradigm of care. And the reason that is so stunning is I had been told in my reporting that, of course, people with schizophrenia, that diagnosis, needed to be on these drugs forever, long term. They reduced the risk of relapse, and therefore they provided a long term benefit. But suddenly there was this difference at an international scale where the drugs were being used differently, produced better long-term outcomes. And those better long-term outcomes, by the way, stayed true 15 years later and even 20 years later. So I became curious to know, why would living in a developed country be a strong predictor that you won't have a good outcome if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia? That was one. And number two, why hadn't outcomes improved, which is what I believed, with the advent of antipsychotic medication? So at that point, I got a contract to write a book called, and which became the book Mad in America. And I turned it into a history of the treatment of the seriously mentally ill in America, going back to colonial times until modern times. And one of the reasons I did that is, the past can often be a foil for understanding the present. If you understand the past, you can get a better sense and perspective on what you're doing today. So what I'll do in the next 30 minutes, and then if, I don't know if people from Facebook can ask questions, but I'll give a talk about 30 minutes about this historical look at how we have in the United States and Western world have conceived of madness, severe mental illness, and how we've treated it. And there's really four, and that'll bring us up to the modern era and give us a sort of understanding of how our modern conceptions differ from past conceptions, and both in whether that is a strength or is in some ways a weakness. So there are really four, broadly speaking, four periods of care of the seriously mentally ill in the United States. And each time it reflects, the type of care reflects an attitude towards the seriously mentally ill, a conception of what has happened to people who at times are called insane, mad, and that sort of thing. So if we go back to colonial times, this was a time when it was often seen as the age of reason. And in the philosophical terms, they talked about how, and you could see this in the textbooks of mad doctors, that reason was the faculty that separated humans from animals. That's what made us different in kind. But they said, so the insane or the mad, by virtue of having lost their reason, had descended to a lower level of being, a brutish level, more akin to being animals. Now, once you have this conception of human beings as having, because they lost their reason, of having descended to a lower level of being, that engenders rough treatment. And in essence, because they were conceiving them, if you look at mad doctor texts in the 18th century, and even going back to the 17th century, rooted back in England, they talked about how the seriously mentally ill, the mad, you needed to induce fear in them, because that's how you got animals to behave, and this is how you're going to try to quiet and control the mad. And would even say that they would talk about the need for whips. There was also the thought that, like animals, they were impervious to heat and cold, so they could just keep them in almost like a barn-like stall, unheated and cold. And when the first hospital opened in colonial America, the Philadelphia hospital, it included a basement section, a cellar section, or a ground section for the mad. And in that section, there were whips kept around for keeping the people in line, and they also so that sort of thing. Their bedding was straw. Often they were left naked. And most notably of all, they were treated like animals in a zoo. So people from Philadelphia could come out on Sunday, pay a little tiny fee, and look at these human animals, so to speak. Now, so this is the conception that is present in colonial America. And then shortly after we became an independent country, there was a man named Benjamin Rush, was often remembered today as the father of American psychiatry, and he was a Quaker, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And he introduced medical treatments into the care of the insane at Philadelphia Hospital. Today, we see these treatments as very harsh, and we wonder about them. So, for example, his first invention was the tranquilizer chair. And the tranquilizer chair, which is present, to have an example of it present in the Gore Museum, we see it as an instrument almost of torture. People would be strapped to this chair for days on end. There was a little hole. It was like a toilet seat. So they basically were strapped to like a toilet seat for days on end. And while in that position, they would be heavily bled. This was part of the usual retinue of medical treatments. And after 2-3 days of the tranquilizer chair, Rush said, it's a very effective treatment. People are now quieter, more docile. They're not making as much. They're not causing as much disruption within the cells. And he even had a medical rationale for it, and it's really a blood imbalance story. He said the problem with madness is that you get too much blood to the brain, and therefore by bleeding people profusely, you were draining the body of the brain of this excess blood and bringing it back into balance. So he actually had a medical theory on this, and this was a treatment that in fact was then exported to the United States. Now there were other there was drowning therapy that was promoted at the time. With drowning therapy, you would constantly dunk people, and the thought was that somehow this would bring people back to their senses. As far as depression, they would put people on a spinning wheel with their feet tied to the middle, and the idea with this would force blood into the head. So depression was seen as too little blood and help rouse the patient. But what you see in all this time is a very simple bottom line. You see, there is a conception of the, quote, mad as different from us, as the other, and as less than, and as a group that needed to be controlled, and often and in essence, control and quieting the patients, keeping them quiet, was of the first importance. Okay, and then when we look back, we often look with horror on those early treatments, or we're sort of aghast. But I think it's important to understand, especially with Benjamin Rush and say his tranquilizer chair, he saw it as a helpful therapy. He did not see it as an abusive therapy. He was seeing it as something that had the effect of quieting people, but that was seen as a benefit and helping people restore their senses. So, but then in 1792, Quakers in York, England, stirred what is going to be the second period of time of thinking about the mentally ill or the mad in America. And what the Quakers in York, England said was this. They had one of their members who died in the famous asylum of Bedlam in the United States and was chained to the walls and that sort of thing. And they said this person is brethren. They said this is Quakers, as you know, with Quakers, they worship in a circle. They think of each other as brethren. There isn't even the sort of minister as hierarchical over the flock. They conceive of the person as brethren. Now, once they conceive of, quote, the mad as brethren, they say, what do we need to do? Well, they're, of course, of God. They believed in God, and they sort of believed, and thus they believed that people who had lost their reason, lost their senses, had gone into a period of madness, still had a God-given capacity to recover their reason and their mind. And their job was to nurture that God-given capacity, help it become manifest. And so what did they do? They built a small retreat, the York Retreat in York, England, out in the countryside. And their idea was this: being out in nature can be healing. So they would go for walks, that sort of thing. They would garden. They thought good food was important. They would eat 3 to 4 times a day and have a glass of sherry in the afternoon. That was seen as important. They had libraries, and the whole idea was we will treat them as brethren, as capable of managing themselves. The idea was, if you read the first book on this, kindness is so important. We want to be, because kindness is a way to get people to be with others. They would dress well. They would have poetry readings, exercise classes. And there was a sense that if they behaved well, they would sit at the table with the superintendent. And it was seen as a non-medical therapy. It was seen as an environmental therapy of nurturing back to life brethren who had this God-given capacity to regain their senses. Now, they understood, this was the Tuke family who started this, that not everyone would get well, but they said, even though if we can't help everyone get well, we still have an obligation, a moral obligation to treat them as brethren and to make them as comfortable as possible. Now, they opened this new retreat in 1796, and in 1812, they published their first report. And what they found was, with those who were newly admitted into their retreat and had been less ill for less than a year, 70% recovered with this hand of kindness and never relapsed by 1812. So this was seen as a new way of thinking about the MAD, quite different from the medical way of thinking it. And Quakers in the United States began opening the first, and this went under the rubric of moral therapy asylums in the United States. For example, McLean Hospital opened in, I think it was 1812. This is outside of Boston, as a moral therapy asylum, modeled after the York Retreat. There was one in Philadelphia, one in Hartford, and the idea with this model of care was they needed to be small, up to no more than 250 patients maximum. They needed to be in the country. It was nice to have beautiful buildings, because they said the MAD are quite sensitive to the architecture. They needed to be nicely landscaped, because again, nature can envelop you and encourage this return to wellness. And everything else, there would be dances, people would dress in normal clothes. If you see this, they would have newspapers, poetry readings, they'd go for walks, and that sort of thing. And these moral therapy asylums proved to be successful. Historians have gone back and looked at case report forms and looking at the type of people came into the moral therapy asylums, and they were clearly quite crazy. By that, I mean unable to function in society. And in the best long-term study that we have came out of Worcester Asylum, which was the first public moral therapy asylum in the United States. And from 1833 to 1846, of the 984 patients who were discharged during that 13-year period, they followed them up for 30 years. 58% remained well throughout life, and another 7% relapsed, but subsequently recovered and returned to the community. The remaining third either became chronically ill or died in the institution. But you basically see a recovery rate of 2/3. Now, and if you look at the case report forms, these were people who were psychotic, we would say, quite mad. And historians who've gone back and looked at this say that this is, in fact, is the best outcome for mad patients that we have ever had in our history. And it was basically a non-medical. The idea was that environment heals. Oh, and there's one really important point here is, one of the ideas was holding up to the patients a mirror that reflected back to the patient, the person, not an image of a madman unable to live in society, but rather of a well-dressed person who could, in fact, eat and be with among others in a controlled manner. And as people behaved in this way, they were rewarded with eating with the superintendent's table and that sort of thing. So the big thing was they conceived of the mad as brethren, and they held up a mirror to them saying, you can regain control of yourself and move on. By the way, some of these early asylums eventually had baseball teams and all, and they would go out and travel. Anyway, what happened was, though, over time, medical doctors, mad doctors, wanted to gain control of these asylums because initially they were done really as religious places, okay? And they wanted to bring medical treatments into the society. And in fact, the American Psychiatric Association formed in 1854 by a number of doctors who had moved into these asylums and started asserting control over them. And you can see why they want to do this, because mad doctors saw this group of patients as their domain. And like any medical profession, they want to keep the patients in their domain. Nevertheless, these were seen as successful. And you can go back, and in your hospital, for example, and your asylum was built in this model initially in St. Joseph's, because you had a beautiful building there. I'm sure the grounds were very nice. You would grow your own food. This was all in this model. But what happened was Dorothea Dix, who was a reformer in the United States, and Dorothea Dix had her own problem with sort of psychosis, a breakdown, and she had gone to the York Retreat in the United Kingdom, where she was treated with moral therapy and she regained her health. So she made it her mission to provide this form of care, not just in private moral asylums, but in public asylums. And so she went around and actually building asylums for the mad was the first great public works first great public works program in the United States, was building these asylums. But what happened once they were built is communities starting putting in all their patients with neurological disorders. They began serving as nursing homes, patients with syphilis, patients with we would identify as Alzheimer's disease today. And so suddenly you weren't getting people who may have had a bout of psychosis, but so often they began to function as nursing homes for chronically ill patients with things like syphilis that ends up with a psychosis. Now, Parkinson's disease wasn't identified at that time, but that's a type of Parkinson's disease often has psychotic features. But anyway, there were people with neurological disorders now became or old age dementia, that sort of thing. The brunt of the patients stopped getting well. And by the end of, and because of that, by the end of the 1800s, moral therapy came to be seen as a failed form of care. But what failed was the fact that we turned these smaller environmental asylums, governed by Quaker principles of seeing people as brethren, into these large institutions that became impersonal, and in fact were populated to a large degree by people with neurological or old age dementia. So so moral therapy was declared as a failed form of care. And then what replaced it, the next conception, which begins to take hold in the United States in the late 1890s, is a eugenic conception of the mentally ill. Now, eugenics is an idea that came out of England that there are people with good genes, the eugenic part of the population, and then there are people with bad genes, known as the cacogenic. And in order to nurture a healthy society, you needed to encourage those with good genes to have babies and discourage those with bad genes not to have babies. Now, once this begins to be promoted in the United States, and it was reported, by the way, at Ivy League universities as a science, there became a big effort to categorize people by their eugenic sort of qualities, and ranking their eugenic qualities, who was the best in society. In fact, county fairs in the early 1900s would even, you'd have best of pig in the fair, you'd have best cow, you'd also have best human in the fair. People would compete to be seen as having the best genes. Anyway, once this happened, you begin ranking people. And frankly, because the promoters of this idea were mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, they, of course, saw white Anglo-Saxon Protestants at the top of this eugenic scaffold, the most, with the best genes. And now at the bottom, who are we going to have at the bottom? Well, the freedmen, the African Americans freed at the end of in the Civil War, were seen as, of course, at the bottom. But even below them was, quote, the mentally ill, the mad patients. They were seen as the most unfit in our society. And there was a whole ranking, like Jewish people were ranked less, and people from Eastern Europe and that sort of thing. But the mentally ill now are seen as carriers of bad genes. And you can start reading in the early 1900s that insanity is a single gene recessive disorder. If your mom has one of the two genes, the insanity gene, and their father does not, you can become a carrier, but you won't be insane because it's a recessive gene. But if your mom's a carrier, but maybe not insane, has one of these genes, and your dad is a carrier, and you get those two genes, you're going to be insane. And this was the idea. So with this idea being promoted at county fairs and around the country, there was an American Eugenics Society. What began happening? First, they said, we have to remove these people from our society because they're a threat to us, because if they breed, they'll help spread these bad genes. So people would be, and they would say, we need to put people into asylums and keep them there until they've passed their breeding years. And what you see now is for first episode psychotic patients who were still being somewhat often discharged from the moral therapy asylums, they're now being kept in there long-term as much as possible to remove them from the possibility of having kids. That's the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened was states began allowing to forcibly sterilize the, quote, mad. And in 1927, in a case called Buck versus Bell, the United States Supreme Court said that was a constitutional. It was okay to forcibly sterilize the mentally ill because they were, in fact, a burden on society. There was even some talk about euthanasia, and Nazi Germany in the 1930s, because it wanted to implement a sterilization program, actually sent scientists to the United States to look at our history of sterilizing people. I forget how many people were eventually sterilized, but I think it was over 40,000 people in state mental hospitals during this time. Now, with this new idea, this new conception of the mentally ill as an unfit, a burden on society, now, once again, they're no longer seen as having any intrinsic value, okay, as human beings. And what we get in the 1930s and 1940s then were a series of very aggressive medical therapies that were hailed at the time as basically miracle surgeries, but they were also known as, and researchers talked about this, as brain disabling treatments. So we had metrazole convulsive therapy, which was basically a type of poison, metrazole, that made people have an incredible seizure. Now, it was so painful, people would almost do anything in order to avoid having metrazole convulsive therapy. It was shattered teeth, that sort of thing. Then they learned, then we also had something called insulin coma therapy, where they would give people so much insulin, it would put them into a coma. Then they'd give them like orange juice to withdraw them from the coma. And people found that when they came back, they were acting more like children, and that were very much more docile. That was seen as a beneficial. Then we got electroshock therapy, which was seen as a better way of inducing seizures than metrazole convulsive therapy. And then finally, we got frontal lobotomy. Now, if I had two brains here, if I had a brain of a chimpanzee in one hand and a brain of human in the other, you would notice one difference in them. The frontal lobes of the human brain is very pronounced compared to the chimpanzee brain. And what they did with frontal lobotomy was they would, initially they drilled in from the side and they would just scramble the frontal lobes. And then eventually Walter Freeman developed a method where he would put the ice picks up through the eye chamber and scramble the frontal lobes that way, and it would take like 50 minutes. Now, the inventor of frontal lobotomy was a Portuguese neurologist named Egas Moniz, and he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for inventing frontal lobotomy. There was research done in the 1940s that said it either cures people, improves people, or they stay the same. No one gets worse. Now, we know that what really happened is it turned many people basically into zombies. And there's a description in Walter Freeman's book of how such and such a patient before might imagine what would have happened in American history if the indigenous people had won, and with what sort of history had pursued, or people who loved to play pianos. And now these people sat idly by the window like a cat watching the world go by. And that was seen as a good change in being. And the reason it was seen as a good change in being because people were seen as quieter, as less disruptive, and they weren't seen as having any intrinsic value. Anyway, again, not the today frontal lobotomy is remembered as a disfiguring therapy, as a brutalizing therapy, but at the time it was seen as a miracle therapy, and it was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. Now, the next stage, the final stage of this, and we'll finish this up quickly, is in 1955, we get the first drug that is remembered today as the first antipsychotic. This is chlorpromazine, and it was marketed as Thorazine. And in conventional histories, this is seen as the start of a great advance in care, the psychopharmacology area. We got antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents, all in the course of 5-6 years. And for example, Edward Shorter said, the introduction of chlorpromazine was as profound an advance in medicine as the introduction of antibiotics in medicine. Now, there's been hardly any advance in medicine as profound as antibiotics to beat as a way to treat infectious diseases, bacterial diseases. And so that was how, and so in conventional histories, it is seen as a big break from the past. That we now have, and think of the drug antipsychotic, that these drugs somehow are an antidote to the biological cause of madness, or an antidepressant. These are antidotes. And so it's sort of an antibiotic model of thinking, okay? And now this is going to put the problem within inside the person's head. There's something amiss with their chemistry, and the drugs fix that, or an antidote to whatever's going wrong in the head. Now, when I wrote my first book, Mad in America, I went back to the introduction of antipsychotics. And here's the thing. When they were first introduced, they weren't seen as a break with the past. They were called neuroleptics, meaning taking control of the nervous system. And they were praised for causing a chemical in body because they quieted people, made them more disinterested in their environment, the same thing that frontal lobotomy did. And it was even noted that this drug acted in particular on the frontal lobes and also on other parts of the brain. But that was part of what it did. And in 1967, we had the first major study looking at, with the advent of the antipsychotics, were people now functioning better over the long term. It was done at Boston Psychopathic Hospital. And they actually found in this first research that patients were now relapsing more frequently than before. They may have been getting better a little faster, but they were now relapsing more frequently than before. And they were much more socially dependent, in need of welfare and that sort of thing, than the group treated in 1947 without antipsychotics. So what you actually see, if you go back in the history, rather than a big break with the past, there's a bit of a continuation of looking at drugs that can quiet people and make them less interested as a very helpful therapy. But that's the same way lobotomy was initially seen as well. Now, in the 1960s and 1970s, there were basically three schools of psychiatry. There was a biological psychiatry that really promoted the use of the antipsychotics. There was a group that said, the problem really arises from, there are social determinants of health, poverty, racism, that sort of thing. And so much of difficulties arise from those societal problems that exist. And then there was also basically a psychoanalytic idea, psychological sense that difficulties in the family often led to problems for people, psychosis, mania, et cetera, et cetera. So there were these three wings. And then in 1980, the American psychiatry consolidated into a biological framework. And I could go in, but I'm going on too long already. But the new idea was, we're going to categorize mental disorders, major mental disorders, as diseases of the brain, that they exist within our brain. And this is going to eliminate much thinking about what happened to people or environmental problems that may have driven people into difficult states. And very quickly, two things happened once they adopted this conception when they published the third edition of their Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1980. They called this a revolution. They called it a medical model, but it's a really disease model. And they began promoting this conception to the American public. And what did we quickly learn? We learned that the idea was that people had chemical imbalances in the brain, that schizophrenia, for example, was due to too much dopamine, that depression was due to too little serotonin, and then we now had the drugs that could fix those imbalances, like insulin for diabetes. So antipsychotics, by blocking dopamine, brought that back into balance. Antidepressants, by increasing serotonin, brought serotonergic activity back into balance. And pharmaceutical companies were thrilled with this new idea and this new conception, because in addition to severe disorders, they were saying that anxiety and basically ordinary unhappiness could be seen as depression. And of course, attention deficit disorder was newly introduced in 1980. So what the pharmaceutical industry understood at this time, this is going to greatly expand the market for psychiatric drugs. And they also understood that this story of drugs that fix chemical imbalances was a great way to sell drugs. And so what happens in the 1980s and 1990s, the drug companies began paying academic psychiatrists to bring their thought leaders, to test their drugs, consultants, advisors, and together they promote this story of a great advance in care in which we discovered that major disorders are due to chemical imbalances, and we have drugs that can fix them. Now this represented, and think about this for a moment. Human brain is extraordinarily complex, and we were being told they had discovered the very molecule that causes psychosis, the very molecule that causes depression, could put it back into balance. And if that were true, that would be the greatest advance in medical history, in my opinion, given the complexity of the brain. And there were educational campaigns run by the APA to convince us of this. We saw our ads. And here's the tragedy. That hypothesis never panned out. It was a false story. What happened was it arose from an understanding of how the drugs acted on the brain. So, for example, they understood antipsychotics blocked dopamine. So they hypothesized that people with schizophrenia had too little dopamine, had lesions in the dopaminergic system, but they never found that to be so. Same with people with depression. Antidepressants up serotonergic activity, so they hypothesized that depression was due to too little serotonergic activity. But then when they actually began investigating this, do people with depression have low serotonergic activity? They didn't find it to be so. In 1983, the NIMH said, we've investigated and we just haven't found that a serotonergic lesion in the system is a cause of depression. And believe it or not, in 1999, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook said that this hypothesis had not been borne out. It was a dead hypothesis, but it was kept on promoted to us as a way basically to sell drugs and that sort of thing, and get people to tell drugs. Now, get people to see drugs in that light, as that sort of curative light. By the way, as a medical reporter, I wrote about the chemical imbalance theory. I believed in it. And what happened is when I did that series for the Boston Globe, I was writing about drugs that fix chemical imbalances. And I asked researchers at that time, can you just tell me where you found that people with depression had too little serotonin? Or can you tell me where you found that people with schizophrenia had too much dopamine? And here's what they said. Well, we didn't actually find that. We say that it's a metaphor that helps people understand why they need to take their drugs. But unfortunately, what we now know, it's 2024, with this disease model of care, you actually see a decline in long-term outcomes compared to what they were from 1955 to 1975, when there was more ideas of socialization, et cetera. Schizophrenia recovery rates have now dropped below to what they were in the first third of the 20th century. Depression tends to run a more chronic course. And in my opinion, the problem we have today is we've organized ourselves around what might be called a marketing story, as opposed to a science story. And if we had a story of science, which is the story I told in my second book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, you would use these drugs much differently. You would use them more for short-term stabilization and try to minimize long-term use. That is an idea, and that book was published in 2010, and that is an idea now taking hold in many communities around the world. We've been misusing these drugs. We got to use them differently. And we really need to put some focus on psychosocial care and environmental care. And my final book on this was a book that I co-wrote with Lisa Cosgrove called Psychiatry Under Influence. And that was while I was a fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University, studying institutional corruption, is what were the forces that led psychiatry to tell us this story, and what harm has it done, and how might we recover from that story of corruption? So that's the 35-minute of the history of psychiatry in the United States. And if I were to be asked, and if there's any questions from Facebook or whatever, but if I were to be asked what is the bottom line here, it's this. The first thing is, how are you conceiving of, quote, the seriously mentally ill? If you're conceiving them of brethren, as like us, as not as the other, you'll develop forms of care that you would like to be treated with, that do emphasize like environment, building better environments, helping people build their life back, regain the ability to be with others, have a narrative for going forward that is optimistic rather than pessimistic. And by the way, in Northern Finland, they developed exactly that form of care in 1992. It's called open dialogue therapy. And their outcomes improved dramatically, and within years were the best in the Western world. But if you see people as defective, as diseased, you start becoming afraid of them. You see them as less than, and you start seeing them as sort of chronically ill, and you start reducing the possibility that people might just have a difficult time and then get better. And that's actually, if you look in nature, so often the natural course of even major psychiatric disorders tell of episodic problems that actually go away so often with time. Anyway, bottom line is we need to have a conception that is based in a humanistic conception of people as brethren. And we also need to understand that often there is the capacity to recover. It's not necessarily a chronic disorder, and that environment matters. We human beings are built to be responsive to our environment, and things like shelter, food, meaning in life, all of these things can be, steps towards a full-fledged recovery. And last, I'll give you an example. One last quick thing. There's a group in Connecticut, for example. They run something called Volunteers for Psychotherapy. They're psychologists. And what happens is people coming out of mental hospitals can come to them for free psychotherapy care. But in order to pay for that care, for every hour of care, they have to do 2 hours of volunteer work. And now by doing volunteer work for others, shelters, bringing food to the elderly, suddenly they have something that gets them out of the house. It can serve as a positive sense of identity. What do? I help the elderly. I help with dog shelters or whatever it might be. I help with the homeless. And they're no longer always seen as the one being helped. They're helping others. They can find meaning in that life. And as one of the founders of it often says, or has told me, I'm not sure of the value of the psychotherapy, but I'm quite sure of the value of volunteering. That's an example of how an environmental approach can often lead to good outcomes. So I think that's about 40 minutes on the button.
Yeah, I think you're right. Thank you. That was fascinating. I did not know all of that history and all the different outlooks through time in reference to mental illness. So thank you very much for your work and your talk. Kim, do you have any questions or comments that you would like to make before we get off here? Or Facebook people? I'm looking at our Facebook as well. So if you have a question or comment, this is the time to put it in. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any questions or comments.
Hopefully I didn't bore everybody.
Well, you certainly didn't bore me. I
Okay,
found
that's
it
good.
very informative, and we will push this out on our social media platforms. It will also go on our YouTube channel, so it will be up there for people that are interested in your topic. What we have found is that when it comes to the field of mental illness, people are still stigmatized about that. And so they don't want to necessarily come to a talk, but if it's online and being broadcast, they will find it and watch it. So hopefully this will reach whoever needs to do that.
Great.
So
Well, thank you very much for having me and for this opportunity.
thank you, Bob. I certainly appreciate it. You take care.
You too now. Ciao.
Okay, bye-bye.